All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the newest episode of this show, number four. I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Philip Bruner. Philip is a professor of practice of sustainable finance at Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. He is the director of the Climate Risk Lab in the school. We met exactly a year ago. Well, slightly less than a year ago at
That's
Climate
right.
Cap in Berkeley and had a great
Berkeley.
conversation. I am so grateful to continue it with it. Philip, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's nice to see you again.
Same here. Well, let me ask, like I always do with my guests. Philip, can you tell us what keeps you up at night?
Well, right now there are numerous things, but let's just focus on one for this episode. Um, I will call it the climate narrative collapse is keeping me up at night right now. The failure of the Paris Climate Accords narrative to produce um, change in the way that it was envisioned. I think it's a total failure to be perfectly honest.
And it's crystal clear now to anyone paying attention that that 1.5 degree target, we've passed it already. It's way behind us. It's
We
crystal
have.
clear that the risks haven't gone away. That even with a change of a resident in the White House, if I may speak that way, the laws of physics haven't changed. Um,
Nope.
have you given up as an academic, or is this more of it's time to reframe the problem and find another way to get there?
Well, I certainly have not given up, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, not just as an academic, but also as a practitioner. So, professor of practice here in the U.S. means I'm basically someone who comes from the private sector, but I happen to have a PhD. So, most of my experience dealing with this issue comes from working in the private sector. And my obsession for the last 20 years or so has been, how can we accelerate capital at scale into distributed energy with, with an emphasis on, of course, equity. And so I've experimented with different business models and whatnot throughout my career. And I still believe that, finance has a key role to play here. So I haven't given up. I'm very bullish on, the future of finance as far as, innovative business models are concerned. But I do think the narrative has to change. And if you don't mind me going into it a little bit,
Please do. Yeah.
I have a thesis around this, and my thesis is rather simplistic. I mean, I think there are really kind of two, I don't want to call them half truths, but there are two kind of misunderstandings at the heart of the Paris heuristic, let's call it, that don't really make sense in practice. The first is, the assumption that if we electrify our transportation, our agricultural methods, and our energy sources, if we switch all of those over somehow magically to clean energy sources, that's going to turn the climate problem off. That the global climate system functions with an on-off switch, and that's simply not true. We could electrify all agriculture, all transport, all clean, power all transportation with electric vehicles, and switch all of our power supply over to clean energy, including nuclear. And we would still have runaway climate destabilization. I use the term destabilization when I teach my MBAs on this topic because that's more reflective of what's happening. So, you said we've already passed 1.5 to 2 degrees of global annual temperature increase. That will certainly double in our lifetimes. And we're seeing a fracture in financial markets and also in operational risk for many businesses as a result of this. So the first half truth of the Paris narrative that has failed is this argument that by investing in renewables and clean energy and electrified transportation, we're going to be able to switch the climate problem off, and that's just not true. The climate problem is going to be with us. Period.
Mm.
The second half truth is that we can have clean energy and electrified transportation without petroleum. Petroleum is upstream from these technologies. You don't have solar panels without petrochemicals. And you don't have wind turbines without petrochemicals. These technologies are symbiotic. Petroleum is the manufacturing input for basically everything. And so that's the other half truth. And you often hear in the popular media that we need to choose between oil and renewables, but that's simply not the case. Without oil, there are no renewables. Without oil, we don't really have a modern economy. So that's the other issue. And if I could wave a magic wand and go back to Paris, and be a benevolent dictator, I would have kind of moved many of the climate scientists away from the center negotiating table and replaced them with chemical engineers, folks representing some of the large state-owned energy enterprises like Saudi Aramco, and had a more frank conversation. Because the twist on all of this is that as the weather destabilizes, these are the industries that stand to lose the most in terms of their bottom line. Not
Mm.
because of anything to do with regulation or policy, but because as the weather destabilizes, which is inevitability, they have heavy, difficult to transform assets, and they are the most exposed to weather disruption. And that's how if I had a magic wand to wave, that's how I would change the narrative.
That all of this is very striking, and I think it goes straight to, as you say, the half truths, the ones that we've come to believe on such complex topics. Has your research or your exploration led to any a conclusion about what would be? I hesitate to call this a happy outcome, but a satisfactory outcome. You spoke about the business models earlier. What would
Yeah.
what could work? What could look like something, if not successful, at least satisfactory?
Well, here's the plot twist. There is a silver lining here, and it is that distributed renewables, while they might not switch the climate problem off, are still really good for infrastructure resilience. So, one of the biggest financial risks at the moment to the global economy is the threat that extreme weather events pose to the power grid. Distributed renewable energy systems are more resilient operationally in the face of more extreme weather events. They distribute points of failure on the grid, and so, you can have a couple of power plants in a distributed microgrid knocked offline and you'll still have power. And you see examples of this providing returns to businesses and governments that have enabled it across the globe, from major retailers to department stores to small cities and towns that have distributed microgrids enabled. These distributed microgrids act as a sort of lighthouse in the event that there's a major flood or flash freeze, convective storm, atmospheric river, fire, etc. So, ironically, the same things that we need to do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions are the things that will make businesses and communities more resilient
Mm,
in a climate unstable future.
mm. And I'm old enough to remember, these debates being framed in the past as adaptation versus mitigation. I'm listening
Hmm.
to you thinking that's done. No one's
Yeah.
really talking about adaptation anymore.
No, I would say adaptation is mitigation.
Yeah, yeah. Which is a striking evolution of the narrative again. Um, I'd love to speak to the professor of finance at the risk of anyway offending the whole set of finance colleagues out there. It feels to me that finance at the end of the day, to put it in a very simplistic way, is about putting a price on risk. Um,
Mm.
do you think that the field has changed, and how so, in the wake of trying to better understand this risk that kind of looks like none other that we've faced in the past? And is that premise actually correct?
Well, my academic background is political economy, firstly. So, I'll be biased here in my response. I'm a political economist. So, I don't believe necessarily that there is such a thing as free markets in their pure state. We know that pricing risk when it comes to climate is currently very challenging, because for a variety of factors, the main one being that, we don't put a price on carbon. So, putting a price on carbon, of course, has negative externalities for typically the lowest earners in the population. We have historic fossil fuel subsidies that are baked into the cost of fossil fuel products. We continue to subsidize fossil energy to the tune of about $1 trillion a year in public subsidy. That's direct subsidy, not indirect subsidy. So the cheapness of fossil fuels is already baked into their pricing. When you try and tinker with that by introducing a carbon tax, it of course raises the costs of gasoline for ordinary consumers and often electricity and heating. And so the poorest, who typically have the least responsibility for their carbon footprint, pay the highest price. So it's a difficult problem to solve through policy. Um, what is interesting, what is happening sort of organically in financial markets right now is that the weather destabilizing effect of climate change, I use the PR term,
Hmm.
is starting to creep into financial markets, just sort of due to the fact that more unstable weather makes it harder to price insurance products. It makes it more difficult to price mortgages. So you see premia, for example, in mortgages that are in areas of high exposure to more extreme floods or wildfires rising. You see it more difficult to get a longer term mortgage in places like Florida, near the Florida Panhandle and the southern coast. California property owners are finding it almost impossible to get access to wildfire insurance. So the costs of extreme weather or the mispricing of insurance is starting to become a topic of interest to MBAs because in order to price the risk, you need to have an understanding of how you predict extreme weather events, which is something is really hard to do. Predicting the weather is a notoriously difficult computational problem. DeepMind actually, we're trying to predict wind flows and pivoted into protein folds, and they were much more successful predicting the structure of protein folds than they were with predicting the wind.
Wow.
So add to that the fact that we have fluctuating weather patterns that are unprecedented. The historical data is less and less useful by the day, and you have a really difficult problem on your hands. How do you price this risk? I do think there's a solution with AI there. Like we'll need AI to help solve this problem ultimately with synthetic data. But not to digress too much, how you price this risk is totally dependent on our ability to understand the risk, which means that we need downscaled climate models that we can localize and layer across different asset classes like real estate, like power grid and whatnot. So right now there's a bunch of volatility,
Hmm.
basically.
And
That's what we
I
see.
guess, yeah, I have two provocative questions to end with. I guess the first one is, given everything you said, and the need to end with to stop it with half truths, is what you said not the outline of a new form of engagement, I guess, of the business community with the issue of climate change, one that is not about saving the world to some extent, but far more about going to risk that has been a topic of interest of so many business curricula and business leaders in the past, except the terms are changing. So is that not maybe another silver lining out there, the reframing of the debate back to basics, so to speak?
I think it is, and you could even say that there's a new market fundamentalism going on. There's a rethinking of all of this on a sort of fundamental economic level in terms of the theory. But resilience is the new buzzword.
Mm.
And you can think of resilience as just, taking into account more extreme weather and making investments up front to ensure that you have your supply chain, for example, your critical vendors, your most important business operations are protected in the event that, there's a flash flood, a convective storm, a wildfire, that you've taken account of these risks and made upfront investments to protect yourself from them. Um, I call this the resilience advantage. I think there's a competitive advantage to making resilience investments. Nothing to do with saving the planet, just
Mhm.
everything to do with accepting the inevitability of extreme weather volatility, having an understanding of how that's going to affect your bottom line as a business, small or large, domestic or global, and making the upfront investments that you need to plan for the inevitable uh, weather destabilization that we're all gonna face. So, and the silver lining again to all of this is that distributed microgrids, clean energy systems, more electrified transport, the integration of smarter grids with business operations simultaneously makes supply chains more resilient, saves costs, and reduces greenhouse gas emissions.
Mm, interesting. And one
Mm,
final question, maybe in the name of hope or maybe in the name of reconciling both sides of the Northern Atlantic, um, current tensions notwithstanding, is
mm,
there any reason to believe that at the end of the day, what may unite the richer economies is a similar exposure to climate without a doubt, but I guess similar infrastructure leading them to look at these things more from a holistic standpoint and a cooperative standpoint than one of
mm.
tension. Is this one basis for the renewal of this transatlantic partnership, do you think? Or is that
Oh
wishful thinking?
gosh, I hope so. I mean, I remember back when I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. When I started my PhD back in 2009, there was a whole European consortium called the Friends of the Supergrid.
Mm,
Used to be headed by Eddie O'Connor, may he rest in peace, who was the CEO of mainstream renewable power. And they were sort of the evangelists for this idea of an interconnected clean energy European supergrid. And they, Eddie, bless his heart, was very, was pushing this narrative that if we just switch over to clean energy, that's going to solve the climate problem, and not acknowledging the symbiosis between petroleum and clean energy. And so threatening the business interests of the most dominant players in energy without engagement, which is foolish. So of course there was a reaction. The fossil fuel industry set up a group called the Magritte Group. Magritte was a Belgian painter known for his surrealist work, so it was tongue in cheek. And the Magritte Group were in a PR contest with the Friends of the Supergrid, and in the end, nothing happened. No one won. It was a failure on both sides. So yes, we need to re-engage. Let's acknowledge firstly that we don't have a global economic system. We don't have modern civilization or technology without petroleum, period, including renewables. Second, let's acknowledge that weather destabilization is a great threat to the fossil fuel industry. And it is an inevitability. And, the longer they kick the can down the road towards investing in resilience, the more it's going to cost them in the long run. So, maybe they should be looking at smart grid integration with fossil fuel technology now rather than, paying 10 times or 20 times more for the same technology in the future.
well, very clear. Philip, you started out by saying there were many things that kept you up at night, so I hope you come back.
Well, thanks. Yeah, next time let's talk about how we need to generate ecosystems, because that's
Yeah.
really the only way we're going to solve the climate problem. Is we need to regrow nature and get back to focusing on conservation, which is the other solution.
And yes, exactly. Exactly. Emphasis on the solution. Well, thanks a million, Philip, and be well in on the West Coast.
Merci à vous, merci à tous.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, everyone.
Bonne soirée. Au revoir.